Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to our Bible study this morning. This morning we are continuing our series on the Old Testament prophecies concerning the Messiah. In this morning's lesson we'll be looking at the promise that says the Messiah would be a Nazarene descended from the line of Jesse. Once again, the Old Testament promises that the Messiah would be a Nazarene descended from the line of Jesse. For this study, we'll be looking at Isaiah chapter 11 to begin. If you would like to be turning to Isaiah chapter 11. But first of all, before we actually get to Isaiah 11, I would like to explain very quickly what we mean by a Nazarene. Because I've found throughout the years there's many times confusion about what's meant when the Bible describes the Messiah as a Nazarene. There's two different titles in the Bible that many times are confused. The one title is Nazarene, the other title is Nazarite. Okay, folks, a Nazarene and a Nazarite are two different things, two different types of people. A Nazarite is somebody who took a vow, a Nazarite vow. It's a special type of vow that they took during Old Testament times and even into the New Testament. That vow you can read about in Numbers chapter 6. It's a vow that basically was a promise to God that they made to abstain from three different things: grape products, cutting of their hair, and touching dead bodies. So when somebody took a vow of a Nazarite, the most basic way I know to explain this is they were promising God they would not partake of grape products, things like grape juice, wine, eating grapes off the vine, anything like that. They promised they were not going to partake of. They also promised God that they would not have their heads shaved, so they would allow their hair to grow long. And thirdly, they promised God that they would never touch a dead body. Those three things. That's what involved the Nazarite vow. People who took that vow were called Nazarites. That is not what we're talking about in this prophecy of the Messiah. In this prophecy of the Messiah, we're looking at the Messiah being called a Nazarene. Okay, what was a Nazarene? It was an inhabitant of the city of Nazareth. Back then, there was a city named Nazareth. People who lived in that city were called Nazarenes. That's what we're talking about in our lesson for this morning. We're talking about the fact that the Messiah was said to be an inhabitant of the city of Nazareth. So as we begin our study, let's just keep that in mind if we would. Okay, that's what we're talking about. Beginning in Isaiah chapter 11. In verse number 1, we find the first time that the Messiah is linked with the idea of being a Nazarene. In Isaiah 11:1. In Isaiah 11:1 it says, "And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse." Okay, if you notice, folks, here we have Jesse being talked about. Jesse was the father of King David. Here we're told that the Messiah would be a descendant of Jesse. It says, "There shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse." Okay, a rod there is a picture, or it's a word that means a small branch or a twig. Okay, here's the idea behind this. You have Jesse described as a stem. Okay, the idea of stem there means a stump or a very large branch. Okay, if you ever look out at a tree, you'll notice, for example, the tree trunk. That trunk was basically what the idea of stem means here, the word stem. So it's basically saying Jesse's going to be like a tree trunk. The Messiah, who we're going to find out is Jesus, the Messiah that comes from this tree trunk of Jesse is going to be like one of the small branches or one of the twigs on that tree. Now, if you notice, the farther away from the tree trunk that you get, the smaller the branches are. You know, for example, the first branches that go off of a tree trunk, they're pretty big. And then the next branch that goes off of that is smaller, and then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, till finally it gets to the twigs at the end. Why would Jesse be called a tree stump, but the Messiah would be called a twig? It's not due to importance. It's not saying that Jesse's the more important of the two. It's not saying Jesse's the stronger of the two. Nothing like that. All it's doing is helping us to understand that the Messiah would be a distant descendant of Jesse. He would be way down the line. That's why he's pictured like a twig. After you have the branch come off the trunk, and then you have several branches come off of that branch, and finally you get to the twig. It's way out there, way separated from the stump or from the trunk of the tree. So that's all this is saying. When it says that Jesse is the trunk of the tree, but the Messiah is going to be a twig off of that trunk, it's only explaining that the descendancy of the Messiah would be several generations ahead, past Jesse. But the point still remains, the principle of this verse is the Messiah would be a descendant of Jesse. Now it goes on. And a branch shall grow out of his roots. Okay, now in this case, we have a different thought being brought out concerning the Messiah. In this case, we see the roots of the tree being talked about. Okay, what are the roots of that tree? Well, if Jesse is the trunk of the tree, the roots of the tree would be the ancestors of Jesse. So what you have is, you have Christ coming, not only through Jesse, but obviously through the ancestors of Jesse. But the interesting thing to notice is this, the title of branch given to the Messiah. The word branch in Hebrew means Nazarene. As a matter of fact, the city of Nazareth, the title, the city of Nazareth, that title Nazareth means the city of branches. So when Jesus is given the title, or when the Messiah here, we're going to find out is Jesus, when the Messiah is given the title branch, it's saying Nazarene. It's the Hebrew word for the city of Nazareth. So folks, here we find in in Isaiah 1, we find a prophecy that is giving the Messiah the title of Netzer. That's the Hebrew word translated branch here, or Nazarene. Let's look at Isaiah 11:10. In Isaiah 11:10, in this text, we see once again the Messiah is related to Jesse. It says, and in that day shall there be a root out of Jesse. Just like a twig springs forth out of a branch, a root springs forth out of the trunk of the tree. Once again, it's saying the Messiah would be a descendant of Jesse. He would be one that would spring forth out of the line of Jesse. Finally, in Isaiah 53:1, he shall grow up before him as a tender plant and as a root out of a dry ground. Once again, we see the coming of the Messiah being pictured as a plant that is growing, coming out of the dry ground. So in each one of these three passages from the Old Testament, we find the Messiah being described as a plant. And the basic principle of two out of those three is that the Messiah would be like a plant in the sense he would spring forth out of the line of Jesse, much like a branch or a twig would spring forth out of the trunk of a tree. In one of those instances in particular, though, the Messiah is given the title of Nazarene because he's called a branch, and that word branch, once again, is the same Hebrew word that they use for the city of Nazareth, the city of branches. Many people believe that Nazareth, before it was settled, was an area filled with trees and branches and overgrowth. And that's why when they settled in Nazareth and when they built the city there, they called it the City of Branches because of the location where it had been built. By looking at those different verses in Isaiah, I hope it helps us to understand Matthew chapter 1, verses 5 and 6. In Matthew 1, 5 and 6, we find the physical lineage of Jesus being talked about. The physical lineage of Jesus. In other words, this is the lineage that involves Mary's line. Remember, Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. He was conceived in a virgin's womb. So Jesus has physical lineage through his mother Mary. Here in Matthew 1, 5 and 6, we read about the physical lineage that Jesus has through his mother Mary. In other words, it's his physical descendancy. Salmon begat Boaz of Rechab. Boaz begat Obed of Ruth. Obed begat Jesse. Jesse begat the king. David the king begat Solomon of her that had been the wife of Urias. Then it goes on. And you'll see in that line that includes Jesse and King David, we'll find later in that line you have Jesus Christ being born. So Jesus' physical lineage was through Jesse. That's exactly what the Old Testament prophecy about the Messiah said. It said that the Messiah would be a descendant out of this tree trunk Jesse. He would be a branch or a twig that would spring forth. He would be a root that would spring forth. So here we can see that is being fulfilled here in Matthew chapter 1 when we're clearly told Jesus was a descendant of Jesse. In Luke chapter 3, verses 31 through 32, here we have the legal lineage of Jesus being given. Now this is, here in Luke chapter 2, this is the genealogy of his, of Mary's husband Joseph. Now you might say, well, how does that apply to Christ? Well, this was Jesus' legal lineage. Since Joseph was considered the legal father of Jesus, in the eyes of the law, Joseph was looked at as the father of Jesus. Therefore, Joseph's lineage will be the legal lineage of Jesus. This is how the government looked upon Jesus. They looked upon him as a descendant of Jesse because his legal lineage was through Jesse as well. If you notice in Luke 3, 31 and 32, which was the son of Meliah, which was the son of Menon, which was the son of Mattatha, which was the son of Nathan, which was the son of David, which was the son of Jesse, which was the son of Obed, which was the son of Boaz, which was the son of Salmon, which was the son of Nathan, and it goes on. But once again, I just wanted to point out to you there, you can see Jesse being talked about in the legal lineage of Jesus. So both Jesus' physical lineage and his legal lineage, both of those included this man named Jesse. A fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy that the Messiah would be a descendant of Jesse. In Romans 5, 11 and 12, Paul attributes the Isaiah prophecy we looked at to Jesus Christ. He said, and again, Isaiah saith, there shall be a root of Jesse, and he shall rise to reign over the Gentiles, and him shall the Gentiles trust. Folks, we looked at that prophecy from Isaiah. And right there, Paul is clearly saying that prophecy Isaiah gave concerning the Messiah is talking about Christ. So we have a clear declaration from the New Testament when it comes to Jesus being a descendant of Jesse. Yes, indeed, he does fulfill the Old Testament prophecy concerning the Messiah in that way because he too was both a physical and legal descendant of Jesse. But what about this idea of being a Nazarene? In Matthew 2, 22 and 23 is where we find that being mentioned. The prophecy that says that he would be a branch, in other words, he was a Nazarene. Where do we find that? Look at Matthew 2:22 and 23. But when he had heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea in the room of his father Herod, he, being Joseph, was afraid to go thither, notwithstanding being warned of God in a dream. He, being Joseph, turned aside into parts of Galilee. He came and dwelt in the city of Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which is spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. Here we find Joseph, the father of Jesus, leading his family into the city of Nazareth to escape the persecution of Archelaus. Here we find that as he brought Jesus, his infant son, into Nazareth, what does that tell us about Jesus? He became a Nazarene. He became an inhabitant or a citizen of the city of Nazareth. We then have it, actually, that prophecy we looked at pointed to. It might be fulfilled which is spoken of the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. Now remember, there's no place in the prophets where it literally says the Messiah would be called a Nazarene. But boy, we've got that verse in Isaiah that called him a branch. And that word branch means Nazarene in Hebrew. So I believe that's the prophecy we're talking about in Matthew 2. It's the one we looked at in Isaiah where he was called a branch or a Nazarene. And what that's saying is Jesus would be an inhabitant of Nazareth. In the Old Testament, the Messiah would be an inhabitant of Nazareth. Here, Jesus was. What's that tell us? Jesus was a Nazarene fulfilling the promise given in Isaiah that the Messiah would be the branch, the Nazarene. Look with me, please, in Matthew 4:13 through 16. And leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum. This is immediately following Jesus' baptism. We're told that Jesus then leaves Nazareth and he comes and dwells in Capernaum. So you can see how for a long period of time, from the time he was just an infant son, when he moved to Nazareth with his parents, Joseph and Mary, until after his baptism, which took place when he was 30 years old. So basically, Jesus was a citizen of Nazareth, maybe 29 years or so. Folks, he was a Nazarene. He lived there for 20-some years. Do you remember what was put on the cross? Remember when Jesus died on the cross, there was an inscription that was put on the cross by the Roman government. Do you remember how they described Jesus on that inscription? Let's read it in John 19:19. Pilate wrote a title, put it on the cross, and the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. See, back then Jesus was even publicly known as a Nazarene. He was known to have inhabited Nazareth. That's how people knew him. When they thought of Jesus, they thought of the fact that this man is one that came from Nazareth. He was a Nazarene because he had grown up. Almost in his entire childhood was lived in Nazareth. But it's so interesting how the Lord intervenes in this thing. You know, they put that title on the cross. Do you realize what he was saying? Jesus is the true promised Messiah. That's what he was saying in essence when he described Jesus as Jesus of Nazareth and King of the Jews. Both of those are prophecies we find in the Old Testament that was said of the Messiah. So when Pilate put that title on the cross trying to describe Jesus, he was actually saying, in effect, Jesus the Messiah. In other words, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Folks, I hope you can see how this is such a precious promise for those of us who are believers in Christ. To know that even though he wasn't born in Nazareth, he still was considered a Nazarene by the general public, fitting perfectly into the Old Testament promise that the true Messiah would not only be a descendant of Jesse, but the true Messiah would be an inhabitant of the city of Nazareth. In other words, he would be a branch. he would be one that came from this city of branches. I want to thank you again for spending this time with me in our study. Please join me next time as we'll be continuing to study the Old Testament promises concerning the Messiah.